Good morning. I'm Jerry Price. I'd like to welcome you to Journey into Life and Work, our weekly Bible study brought to you by our Sunday School department here at First Baptist Church. Today we're continuing our study in the book of Numbers, and we're about 5 lessons in today, and we've been dealing with the Israelites as God has removed them from slavery and freed them from slavery in Egypt and carried them across the desert and headed to the Promised Land, and they hadn't gotten there yet, so we're still working with them, trying to get them into the Promised Land. And so today we're going to be looking at a lesson entitled Lack of Trust, and we see that God calls His people to trust Him in every situation. Well, what do you think about trust? You know, trust is a critical aspect in everyday life, and there's so many things that we trust will happen, or trust. You trust that when you get in your car and you hit the button or you turn on the key that the car will crank and you'll be able to go. You trust that when you put your foot on the brakes that it will stop. We trust that the other drivers that are driving around us will drive safely as well as we. And we trust that the water that we drink is safe and free from any type of contaminants, as well as our food. We trust that that's free. We trust that when we walk in the house and it's dark and we flip that switch, we trust that the electricity is going to be there, don't we? And that the lights will come on. And for people who are working, which some of us do, some of us don't, but anyway, we trust that alarm will go off in the morning and wake us up so that we can get ready to start the day. So, trust is a part of life, isn't it? That we depend on each and every day, and we depend on it in certain things. Well, what happens when you can't trust something that you should be able to trust? Story tells about an event that happened in Chicago in 1982 that resulted in a radical change in everyday life in our world. Popular over-the-counter medicine designed to reduce pain and fever was suddenly poisoning people in the Chicago area, and I'm sure you remember that time. After at least 7 deaths, the product was recalled nationwide. The discovery was made that the medicine had been tampered with and laced with potassium cyanide. Although the identity of the person who tampered with the medicine has never been ascertained, the result of this incident was that from that point onward, the product was sold in triple sealed and tamper-proof packaging. And we deal with that today, don't we? Trying to get into a bottle of something for headaches or pain or whatever. So people ought to be able to trust in what they take for a headache, but in this instance, such trust proved fatal for some. The result of this incident was the creation of a brand new way that over-the-counter medicines are delivered to each one of us. And so as we look at this today, we're seeing that God is wanting the Israelites to trust Him, and as He continues to strive to lead them into the Promised Land. And so as the nation of Israel continued to travel toward that Promised Land, time and time again they were called on to trust God to provide for them. And we've seen that all the way through so far in the book of Numbers. In the past 19 chapters, we've seen that, and God has provided for them. He's provided the water. He's provided the manna. He's provided the quail. He's done everything that's been needed to do in order to secure their journey. But they often chose not to trust God, and the consequences, of course, are usually severe. So as we look at this today, the disobedience of the nation as they tried to force their way into Canaan against God's will. If you'll remember that, that was sort of cycle one as they were going. They tried to enter, and that wasn't the way God wanted them to go in. And then they also had a rebellion of the Levites and some of the tribe of Reuben. All of this was going on within the confines of the people, and they rejected the nature of the priesthood of Aaron. They resented the special role that the family of Aaron played in the worship of God. The rebellious Levites were not content with their role of service to the tabernacle. They wanted to be priests as well. So if you'll remember, when they would go in, the Levites were the ones that were in charge of the tabernacle, and they all had assigned duty. And I think they said it was about 8,500 of these Levites there, and they were in charge of properly setting up the tabernacle every time that they would move, And so anyway, but they wanted to be priests, and Aaron and his sons had been selected as priests. And so anyway, God judged the rebels by having the earth open up and swallow the leaders of that rebellion and taking them out. And God destroyed by fire 250 who had also joined in that rebellion. So he had judgment upon them. And instead of repenting, the people continued to complain against Moses and Aaron. And so in that happening, God sent a plague. And it was among the people that had consumed, I think it was 14,700 people that it consumed. And the plague was only averted when Aaron took an incense burner and walked through the camp, standing between those who were alive and those who had died. And so these cycles of rebellion in the book of Numbers, challenges to the leadership of Moses and Aaron, stand out as a key issue. God himself took the initiative to resolve this strife that was going on about the priest and who would be the leader. And so God instructed all of the 12 tribes to choose to bring a wooden staff to the tabernacle, and the name of each leader was written on this staff, and these staffs were placed in the tabernacle before the Ark of the Covenant. And then overnight, the staff of Aaron not only sprung leaves, but it blossomed, and it produced almonds. And through this miraculous sign, God put his seal on Aaron as the legitimate high priest of the nation. And so it said that this staff was kept in the tabernacle as a permanent reminder to all future generations that Aaron and his descendants were God's only choice for the priesthood. So anyway, God affirmed the priesthood. He affirmed the Levites and the priests there. And anyway, so that's pretty much where we're at today, as the people are still grumbling. They're complaining. As the Israelites journeyed toward the plains of Moab, they entered the wilderness of Zin. And of course, again, there was a shortage of water, and guess what they did? They complained. They didn't trust God for it. He had done provided it before, and they knew that. But anyway, they quarreled with Moses and questioned why he would bring them to such a inhospitable place that lacked food and water. So we're going to Numbers chapter 20, and we're going to begin there in verses 2 through 5. And Teresa, let's see what the problem is.
Okay. Let's read those. There was no water for the community, so they assembled against Moses and Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you led us up from Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It's not a place of grain, figs, vines, and pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Okay, so here they are. I'm not sure exactly how far they've gotten into the wilderness or at what stage this is, but the term uses community. So they have gotten together, and this is all something that we cannot fathom. Especially after I remember the first time I realized or read or learned somehow about the numbers of people that there were here. 600,000 men, and that's counted precisely because several chapters back it lists by tribes the number of men that came through, from Egypt and across the division of the Red Sea and all that. So, but that doesn't even count women and children. So they say if there were 600,000 men, there must have been total numbers between 2 and 3 million. I cannot picture that many people moving as a group through the wilderness. And so when it says the community, that could be several different definitions. It could be all of them. I don't see how they got together like that to do anything. Or it could have been an appointed group. Maybe it was some of the oldest ones or the most prominent ones that got together. A group, anyway, of people came to talk to Moses and Aaron, and it was an assembly. They had a purpose. They knew what they were going to ask for or say or whatever. So they had a common goal. And of course that goal was that there was a lack of water. Well, we can't picture that a lot of times. Now I live out in the country, and we do have problems sometimes. The electricity goes off quite often. I don't know that I guess we have at times not had water. I do remember a couple of times because it's a community water system, and so I sort of know what they're talking about. But imagine they had children, they had livestock, they had all of these things that depended on water in order to live. And they were in the desert, they were in the wilderness, they were out where it was hot and dry. And so they got together and they went to Moses and Aaron. I'm sure they requested a meeting, and so they got together to do their grievances. Now, Jerry's already said, instead of their faith in God, this was not the first time this had happened, that there was a shortage of water, and God had always provided. He had always provided. That they already were receiving the manna to eat. They had food. So God had been providing, and look at what they had gone through. Look at what God had done for these people during the plagues. All of these plagues occurred, and the Egyptian people were affected by the plagues, but the Israelites were not. And they saw God do that time after time after time. And he parted the Red Sea. He stopped the Egyptian army from catching up with these people. The army with all their chariots had come to stop them and load them up and take them back to Egypt. God had done so much for them, but yet they ignored that. They forgot that. They chose to ignore it. And so they've come, now they're bringing their anger on Moses and Aaron. In verse 3, it talks about a contentious dispute, and the people were verbally assaulting Moses and Aaron. I don't think it got to the physical thing, although they probably were mad enough to. But you know what? In reality, they were arguing with God, because God was the one that had provided everything. God would be the one that provided the water if he did. And so they let their circumstances override their common sense and override God's promises. It was just a situation. I mean, they really had forgotten everything, or chose to forget, and decided that they were going to be angry and that they were going to bring it against Moses and Aaron. So the crowd reflected on how wonderful the time was in Egypt. Okay, these people were slaves in Egypt. I mean, Moses had brought them out, and God had brought them out of slavery. They chose not to remember that. They remembered the good times in Egypt, and so that also was ridiculous. And they said, look, this is a death march. You've brought us out here to die. And just look at what you're doing. If you had left us in Egypt, if you had let us stay, we would have plenty of food, we'd have plenty of water. They chose to forget that they were slaves, and they were treated very harshly back then. So they're also thinking about, as I said, their children and their animals, and we think that there was probably a lot of herds of animals that came with them. Remember, when they left Egypt, God touched the Egyptians to give them things. And so the Egyptians freely gave them, we don't know what all, whether it was jewelry and fine fabrics or whether it was food or what. But I'm sure that livestock, the cattle, whatever they had, they did have cows then, and also, of course, they had the sheep and the goats. So we think that they probably gave them a good many herds for them to bring. And so they did have a lot of things to water. They just were not depending on God. And they said, look, we haven't found any grain or figs or vines or pomegranates. And Moses could have turned on them and said, look, don't you remember when the scouts brought back those huge clusters, bunches, vine stalks of grapes? Do you not remember that? You had those, but you refused to go because you did not trust God. And so he could have said that, and he may have said that. We don't know. It's not recorded. But they forgot that they're the ones who did not go into the promised land when they could have, because they did not have the faith that God said, I will give you victory if you go on right now. And of course they wouldn't do that. Because of their sin, they were not experiencing what the abundance of what God had promised them. So, they had complained and all this before, so it's just a copy of it. And Moses is probably getting angrier and angrier. So God had freed them, and they were moving toward the promised land. It would be a while now, but they were moving. But their patience had grown thin, and their faith in God and in Moses was wavering badly.
Thank you, Teresa. Well, in addition to the bondage of Egypt, if they remember, the people also forgot that they weren't enjoying prosperity because of the nation's sin. They still struggled to take responsibility for their own actions. And so we saw the problem, and, as always, God has a plan. So let's look at verses 6 through 8. It says that, Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of the meeting. They fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord spoke to Moses, Take the staff and assemble the community. You and your brother Aaron are to speak to the rock while they watch, and it will yield its water. You will bring out water for them from the rock and provide drink for the community and their livestock. So as Teresa was talking about, we're looking at, we'll say 2 million people, plus all of the livestock, all of the cows and the sheep and everything that was coming along with them. So you can imagine how much water was needed. You know how much water you drink in a day's time, and you just figure that according to 2 million people plus the livestock, and it's a considerable amount of water. But it says that the rock will yield the water. God will provide. You will bring out water for them from the rock and provide drink for the community and their livestock. So God's telling them again that he's going to take care of them. So we can turn to God with our needs and with our concerns, just like he's asking them to do here. So anyway, he says they go to the tent of the meeting. That's the tabernacle. That's the central point of Israel's corporate worship. And so when Moses and Aaron went from the complaining assembly to the doorway, the tent's doorway, they were bringing their concerns before God. They demonstrated proper reverence. It says that they bowed face down before God, and that was an act of worship and humility when seeking God. And so the tabernacle was viewed as God's dwelling place among his people. He was present there. And the appearance of God also indicated that he was about to take action. He was only seen when he was wanting to talk to them, when he was wanting to take action. He was there, And so, God's glory, as we've been told, God's glory probably appeared in the form of a cloud, because when the cloud was over the tabernacle, God was there with them. And so, that they recognized that. They'd seen it, it's a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, so they saw that. And so, God's glory far exceeds humanity's glory. And so, even Moses, for all of his godliness He couldn't look directly at God, lest he'd die. And so, if you remember, Isaiah announced that God would reveal his glory by bringing his people back to the land after years of living in exile. And so, this is what was going on. Verse 7 and 8 said, not only did God appear at the tent, but he also spoke to Moses. Well, guess what? Everyone that was around that area, that was present, heard the voice along with Moses. And so this further affirmed Moses as God's prophet and his chosen leader for Israel. Because he didn't call out anybody else or talk to anybody else. He talked to Moses. But they heard him. And so they knew that God and Moses had a relationship there. And so God talked about Moses and his staff, that Moses carried. We've all seen the pictures of Moses and his Moses staff, And so anyway, it was a long, heavy stick, that maybe was used for support as he walked around the rugged terrain, or maybe protection against animals or something. But anyway, if you'll remember, shepherds always carried staff. They did that to steady their walk as they led the flocks, because, it's hard to be looking up and down at the same time. You're looking at your flock to make sure they're okay as you're walking, and sometimes you have to have a little support. And so anyway, that staff also protected the animals from predators. Well, when Moses fled Egypt after killing the Egyptian, he lived in Midian, and he pastured his father-in-law's flocks. And so that rod, he was familiar with it, and he knew what the purpose was behind it. As a shepherd became the Lord's staff once God called him into service, and that rod. So Moses' staff had no supernatural power in itself. He couldn't do anything by itself, but anyway, God had worked these miracles several times through it, and both in Egypt and in the wilderness. And so we talk about the rock, that's a rugged mountain or a large rock formation. We don't know how big the rock was actually that Moses struck, we can't even imagine how you could strike it and all of a sudden water gush forth. But anyway, it was definitely close enough to the people where all could see it. And so the rocky mountainous terrain, of course, that they're going from Kadesh Barnea through the wilderness of Zin as they're headed toward Moab. And so anyway, we don't know exactly the location in the desert that this happened or at this point. But anyway, God told Moses, he said, speak to the rock. Speak to the rock, and it might provide water for the people and their livestock. So, we see that Moses used his staff to bring water from the rock. And, of course, God had also used Aaron's staff to quiet Israel's complaints. God instructed Moses to use the staff to assemble the people and to speak to the rock to bring out water. And so here we go. We're going to see the results of that as we look at verses 9 through 13. Teresa.
Okay. Excuse me, let's read those. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he had commanded him. Moses and Aaron summoned the assembly in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock for you? Now remember, Moses is very angry as he's talking to them. Then Moses raised his hand, and he struck the rock twice with his staff, so that abundant water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me to demonstrate my holiness in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this assembly into the land I've given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and he demonstrated his holiness to them. Okay, Moses took the staff, got the assembly together. Again, we don't know how many, how long would it have taken to move these people into a group? So, well, let's assemble over here. And you've got 2 million people to move. Again, we're not sure. But unfortunately, Moses' obedience to what God told him to do was very short-lived. He let his emotions get the better of him. And you can understand. Moses was human. Yes, he was very close to God, but he was also human. And he was letting his patience get as short as the people's patience. Instead of speaking to the rock, he spoke to the people. And he spoke very harshly, and he spoke in anger, and he poured out his frustrations in a way that focused more on his anger than God's a miracle that he was about to perform. The Israelites were rebelling against God, and God felt that too. He was disappointed too when they failed to trust him to provide what they needed, because he had already told them he would provide for them. We see the fact that he is a God of love, but he's also a God of justice and judgment. A few centuries later, God would allow the people of Canaan to be taken into captivity. And when Babylon came and King Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem, and then of course also the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and he allowed Babylon to be strong enough and to have the desire to take these people into captivity, God's people, the Hebrews, the Israelites. This was God's judgment. Of course, it was judgment against the Israelites because they had lost faith in God. They had stopped worshiping him, and they were worshiping all these foreign idols. And God said, I have begged and begged, and I've sent prophets to tell you that you need to listen to me, that's where you'll prosper if you listen to me. And they didn't do it. And so we'll see centuries later that God obviously takes rebellion against his word in a very, very serious way. Well, Moses' first faulty step involved claiming the power to produce the water. When he struck the rock, it made it look like he was causing the rock to bring forth water. God didn't even have to bring forth water. After Moses did not do it the way he told him to, it would have served him right if God had not allowed water to come out of that rock. But in his mercy for the people, he did forgive them and sent water. But when Moses struck that rock, it made it look like it was Moses that brought the water out of the rock, and God had intended for the people to see another example of his love and care for them, in them realizing that because Moses was just supposed to speak to the rock, that would have shown that it was God bringing that water forth. So Moses usurped God's authority in a big time way. So instead of speaking to it, he actually hit the rock with that staff. So it says the Hebrew wording signifies that it definitely was a strong blow. God wanted Moses to speak to the rock so Israel would see him through it. Moses decided to strike the rock so that they would see Moses through it. So God was very displeased with Moses and his failure, and he called attention when he was calling attention to himself rather than God. So as a result, and there was a very serious result, God said to Moses, you will not see the promised land after you have gone to Egypt and brought the people out, after you will have been with them 40 years in the wilderness. Because you did that, I'm not going to allow you to sit. And he didn't. He took Moses to the top of Mount Nebo, and Moses was able to see the Holy Land. I think he was able to see Jericho. Jericho was the first city that they came to after they crossed the Jordan. And I think Moses was actually able to see Jericho, but he was not able to go in it. In fact, a few verses later after that, Moses and God were alone on the mountain, and Moses died, and God buried him. Did you know that? Moses did not even have a funeral. Nobody knows where he is buried, just that God buried him. God provided the people with water in our story today. They needed it, but it was at great price, because God was so disappointed in the people for losing faith in him and trusting him, and he was very disappointed in Moses.
Thank you, Teresa. Well, failing to follow God's instruction as Moses struck the rock, and so because of this disobedience, he and Aaron would not enter the promised land. So Moses doing that not only had consequences for him, but also consequences for your brother. So as we've seen today in the lesson, we've seen that as believers we can trust God even when circumstances appear bleak, when we don't think that there's a solution or an answer to it, And we can turn to God with our needs and with our concerns. God's always there for us. He hears us. He listens to us. He understands our hurts and our needs and our desires, and he hears all of that. But we should recognize that ignoring God's instructions definitely leads to consequences, as we've seen in this particular story. So we need to definitely understand that God's way is God's way, and follow him and let him lead, guide, and direct, and then honor him by being obedient. Next Sunday, we're going to continue in the study. We're going to be moving into Numbers chapter 22, and we're going to be looking at God's plan, and we'll see that God can use any means he chooses to accomplish his will. So hopefully you'll have the opportunity to read that and be prepared as we come together again next Sunday. So for Teresa Henry, for the TV ministry here at First Baptist Church, I'm Jerry Price, hoping you have a great day in the Lord, and we look forward to being with you again next Sunday as we journey into life and work. Thank you for being with us today.